Good evening, everybody, in person and those of you on Zoom. My name is Ahmed Shamsi. I'm chair of the NELC department, and it's my great honor to welcome all of you to the Heshmat Moayed lecture. Heshmat Moayed was the founder of the Persian program at the University of Chicago. He came here in 1966, taught here until 2010. And it's really his achievement of making the University of Chicago one of the centers of the study of Persian language and Persian literature in the Western world. Him and his student Frank Lewis have really established this place, and it's a great pleasure for us to have had an anonymous donor who has enabled us to celebrate both Professor Moayed and Professor Lewis in dedicated lecture series in their names. And as I said, I welcome all of you. There is his widow Ruth is on Zoom, I understand. And now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Pune to introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you, Professor Al-Shamsi. Thank you all for being here on Zoom and in person. And I would like also to thank Sarah and Salma for making this event possible today, and the camera crew as well. So first, allow me to say a few words about the background history of Heshmat Moayed lecture series. In 2018, the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations inaugurated this lecture series in Persian literature and culture, which was made possible by a generous gift to NELC and the Humanities Division to support one lecture per year on Persian literature or culture to honor the legacy of NELC Professor Heshmat Moayed. Now a few words about how Professor Moayed came to the University of Chicago, as described by our late Professor Franklin Lewis. Quote, "In the fall of 1964, Heshmat Moayed was contacted by Mohsen Mahdi of the Department of Oriental Languages and Literatures at the University of Chicago, soon to change its name to Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, which planned to create a program in modern medieval Persian language and literature. Although Old and Middle Persian had been taught at the Oriental Institute in Chicago, modern Persian had only been occasionally and irregularly offered. Beginning in 1962-1963, a regular Persian class was offered through a graduate student from Tehran. And now the need for a professional appointment was realized. Professor Moayed applied, and an offer was extended early in 1965 for an assistant professorship with the aim of training students in Persian literature, philology, literary criticism, and literary theory, and Islamic studies. He arrived in Chicago and began teaching courses in Persian language as well as literature in 1966. He remained in this position for 44 years until his retirement in 2010." End quote. Heshmat Moayed was also a prolific author, publishing 10 books and over 100 articles and reviews on literature, religions, and history of Iran, as well as literary translations of Persian novels, short stories, and poetry. Professor Moayed inaugurated and organized the weekly circle Anjuman Sukhan at the University of Chicago. Professor Moayed trained several generations of students who became professors at many prestigious universities, including Rome, Texas, Indiana, Emory, Chicago, and Boston, and he contributed to the work of many colleagues and scholars of Persian language, literature, and culture. To date, we have had 3 lectures in Heshmat Moayed's lecture series, which covered different areas of Persian literature and culture, including She Can't Be Kept Locked Up, The Forgotten Women of Medieval Persian Poetry, which was the inaugural Heshmat Moayed lecture in Persian literature and culture given by Professor Dick Davis in October 2018. The second one was An Hour with Iraj Pezeshkzad, which was done in Persian in November 2021, 2 months and a half before he passed away on January 12, 2022. And the third one was, Is Poetry Superior to Prose in the Worldview of Ferdowsi, delivered by Olga Davidson in November 2022. And today we are honored to have Professor Catherine Babayan as the fourth lecturer of this series. Catherine Babayan is a social and cultural historian of the early modern Persianate world with a particular focus on gender studies and the history of sexuality. She has just received a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship 2024-25 for her current project entitled The Persian Anthology, Reading Along the Margins, which is a gendered history of reading practices in early modern Isfahan. Its centerpiece is a single Persian household anthology authored in the first half of the 17th century by Kazem the Judge, who collects legal documents in Persian with Arabic formulas for marriage, divorce, sales, and rent contracts, tools he used to settle the everyday cases brought before him. A century later, this family anthology was sold in the bazaar and repossessed by new owners who wrote into the folios to make it their own. Multiple seals, inscriptions, and dates mark the life of the anthology as a text passing from one hand to another well into the 20th century, when lithography and print book took over the economy of the book in Isfahan. Babayan's research on Majmu'eh is part of a larger collaboration with fellow Safavid historian Nozhat Ahmadi at the University of Isfahan. Together, they have begun to collect and generate tables of contents for numerous majmu'ah that are housed in Tehran's most prominent public libraries of Majlis, Malek, Melli, and Tehran University. Indexing the various genres of text that comprise each majmu'ah, they take into account the content and organization of these family archives and plan to create a digital platform for their Isfahan Anthology project, where scholars across the world may have access freely to these Persianate world sources. The Isfahan Anthology project stems from Babayan's 2021 book, for which she was awarded the 2022 Honorable Mention Fatma Mersini Book Award in the Middle Eastern Studies Association, entitled The City as Anthology, Urbanity and Eroticism in Early Modern Isfahan, that was published in 2021 by Stanford University Press. The City as Anthology offers a model to study early modern urban culture through anthologies collected in Isfahan's households. It combines historiographies of the book with a scholarship on urban space to intervene in contemporary discussions about experience and materiality from the vantage point of gender and sexuality. Babayan is the author of another award-winning book, Mystics, Monarchs, and Messiahs, Cultural Landscapes of Early Modern Iran, that was published in 2003 by Harvard University Press. She is also the co-author of Slaves of the Shah, New Elites of Safavid Iran, published in 2004 by I.B. Torres, and co-editor of two books, Islamicate Sexuality, Translations Across Temporal Geographies of Desire, published by Harvard University Press in 2008, and An Armenian Mediterranean, Words and Worlds in Motion, published in 2018 by Palgrave Macmillan. Please join me in welcoming Professor Babayan to talk about transgressions of gender in an early modern epistolary rant.
Thank you, Pune. Do you all hear me?
Yeah.
All right. So, thank you for this invitation. Thank you all who are here. Thank you all of those who are on Zoom. It's truly an honor to be giving a lecture in this Heshmat Muayyad series. I met Professor Muayyad in 1991 when I was a predoctoral Mellon Fellow at the Illinois Institute of Technology. They existed then, these predoctoral fellowships, which we really need today. But I was in one of his lectures that he had organized. I don't remember who was speaking, nor do I remember the topic. But what I remember very distinctly was that after the lecture amongst the audience, I heard someone reciting Persian poetry. And I was very drawn to this person. And I went and, waited until he finished and then introduced myself. And lo and behold, of course, it was Franklin Lewis. And it was a wonderful opportunity then to become friends and colleagues with Franklin Lewis. Those of you in the room who know him, he was a very special soul. And so I would like to also dedicate this lecture not only for the memory of Heshmat Moayed, the Ustad, but also the Shagird, Franklin Lewis, who became an Ustad in his own right. Okay, so I am going to be introducing to you today a fascinating letter that is ascribed to a wife of Maulana Bakhtiyari. But before I actually... this working? Okay, so there's... they can't hear me. Okay, so people on Zoom can't hear me clearly? Okay, so how's this? All the way up? All right. My experience is actually when it's all the way out, it's not as good, but you should check. Yeah, it's okay. Why don't you check first? Check with. Right. Okay. So let me first, before talking about this letter, situate the letter. Tell you where I found it, where is it recorded, how is it preserved so that we can today read this letter. These majmu'as, which are, from the Arabic jama'a, gathered together, anthologies is a, shorthand. It's a problematic term to use, but these were produced in thousands in 17th century Isfahan. They're produced in Istanbul and, in Agra and Delhi too. There needs to be studies on them. But what you notice right away is that there's no systematic order of how they're supposed to be written or recorded. There are all these different ways in which the page is filled out with different kinds of paper, most often paper that was produced in Isfahan itself and cataloged as terme. So that's one reason why we have probably, because the paper is accessible, so many of them. But we also know that they were common in households because in the middle, and I don't have a pointer, but where you see actually a very different kind of listing of household goods that a certain son of the Haji Muhammad inherits, and you have a majmu'ah and a Quran, along with copperware and curtains and pillows, that you know that this is something that was also distributed, written, recorded in households. And, in my book, I kind of tried to understand what's going on here. It took me a long time because I had to go through many of them before I really could begin to speculate what these majmu'ahs were. And what I do think they are is that I think that despite what we have imagined, that in 1722, when the Afghans invaded Isfahan, they destroyed the entire archive of, the state archives, the chancery. I think some of these definitely are copies of what letters were recorded, like the Ordubadi example that I talk about in my book. Bureaucrats who worked for the court, but who also recorded for their own, it was part of their professional ownership of their own letters and decrees that they wrote and incorporated in their anthologies, and then mixed it with other things, mixed it with poetry that they liked, mixed it with wax endowments that they owned, mixed it with wills. So some of these definitely are majmu'ahs where they're bureaucratic families. We can imagine how the state archive looked like. Some of them are, single subject anthologies. What we're mostly familiar with as majmuas, so either, composition, insha, or poetry, or books, works on or essays on talismans or astrology, which I'm separating from these multifaceted anthologies, where I see them much more grounded in a production in households rather than in the religious seminaries or at necessarily the Safavi court. So I found this woman's letter in one of these anthologies that I'll be going into a little bit more closely, but I just wanted to also tell you that along with all of these productions of anthologies, household anthologies, we also have a very new phenomena in the city of Isfahan, which is that we have single-page paintings, right? Single-page paintings, why? These are just on one page. They're not in illuminated albums. I think I'm hearing my own echo here, so it's a bit too loud. Thank you. Yeah, it's better. Thank you. In addition, so to think about actually the production of these majmuas alongside the production of these single-page paintings tells you something. Of course, the economy. People had enough money. The trade, the global trade, definitely the trade in silk, and so on, becomes really the hub of trade, and whoever would come, of course, there would, I think, also have to learn the refinement and adab of what it meant like to be living in a city like that of Esfahan. And so here, what I did for my book, this is Muhammad Qasim, who seems to have had, and that's him when he's a little older, and this is him when he's a little younger. He's writing a petition to Shah Abbas, wanting to find work at the court atelier. These painters, and I think I chose him because I think he was one of the most prominent who worked outside the court, right? People who were merchants who had money, they would commission these single-page paintings. And you see some of them are very fast. There's a quick stroke. You don't really need an atelier like this one, where you have paint and you have gold sometimes as well. So the majority of them are these, just with ink and maybe a little bit of red. But what's so important is that they sign, they date. There's a historicity in being able to even trace. Sometimes it says, Kucheya Asta Balfang. So the street of somebody or the person who does Ostad. So you get a sense of actually even the location outside that these drawings were commissioned and drawn. The majority, of course, are men, and the majority of majmuas, as far as we know them, are male authored. It's like a male prerogative. But because they're household anthologies, I think that they were used by women as well within the household. Women being portrayed and depicted happen, but very minimally in comparison to the amount of men. So you see here, surat here, so probably added later on the portrait of a woman who's standing, and here too again you have the exact date, 1050, and I thought it's Seshambe, Siyome Shahr Zulhijjah, I think, Al-Haram, Sana 1051. So interesting for a historian, of course, to think about this consciousness of a historical moment that needs to also be recorded when you are either painting or you're actually writing a majmua. Just to give you a sense of how different these single-page paintings are, that they didn't require the kind of elaborate ateliers that either the shahs had or the provincial courtiers had as well. So it really opens up the market also to others who can pay for these painters' work. So this is all happening in Esfahan, right? In this new center of Esfahan, the Meydan and Naqshgahan. But what is interesting about this letter is that it's happening outside of Isfahan, right? I mean, we don't hear voices of men or women. There are majmuas recorded in Ghazvin. There's some letters of exchange as well between those in Esfahan and those in Ghazvin, let's say at Tabriz. But the majority of this production is really production in Esfahan itself. So I think the uniqueness you'll hear of this voice of this woman, but also the fact that she was to have written outside of Esfahan in the area of the Bakhtiaris. I've designated here for you, but the letter finds its way to Esfahan itself. So, why did I actually include this drawing by Muhammad Qasim, the same painter who was always, whether in middle age or in his youth, trying to actually find work and petitioning. I think you have examples, right, outside of these stock characters of something that's happening, an event. There's a narrative here. There are all these, signs of exchange. Here you have a man who's has prepared a talisman for this woman who's engaged in, in an exchange, whether she's going to pay him for the talisman. And then you have, her friend who's actually pointing to her and who's looking at this older woman who's probably a nanny, the company, the women in the outside, bless you. There's no men. There's no male warden who's actually present. There's something that's going on, and I think it has something to do with love, because the painter, Muhammad Qasim, gives us a symbol of a flower that is usually a symbol of love, right? So the exchange, or maybe the desire of this woman to find out, success in love or not, or in marriage or not, may be part of that narrative. But the example I'm bringing is to show you that we do have historical examples of women, engaging in their own activities and engaging individually, independently. We will find more because there's thousands and thousands of these majmuas. So I'm sure we'll find many more letters. I haven't given up hope. I always said on the lookout, and I had written in my book a chapter on the same bureaucratic family of the Urdu Badis, where the scribe here in red writes down not the name, but that she's the wife of Mirza Khalil, who was a Vakam Nevis in the court of Suleiman. And it's a masnavi that she has composed that is recorded in this family anthology. So, the letter itself of the Bakhtiari woman. The one that I'm going to be talking about is actually preserved in the Majlis library. And I call it a rant because I think, as you'll see, it's not only a verbal, onslaught that you can read here, or a tirade, but I'm actually using rant to sort of refer to the 17th century, where you have, men engaged in anti-clerical expressions, right? It's not a discourse. It's not that everybody is actually using it at the time, but it is actually the beginnings of what you see, or at least, the articulation of what you see later on in the 19th and early 20th century, becoming a discourse that women take on to criticize their husbands who have all these affairs. So I'm going to spotlight this rant that's ascribed to a woman from the Bakhtiari tribal group of lords living, as I showed you, in the vicinity of Esfahan in southwestern Iran. During the early modern period, the Bakhtiaris were semi-nomadic, and in her case, they were agriculturalists. We do not know the given name of the writer because the politics of respectability required the reputation of wives be protected from the gaze of men beyond the household. Rarely do we see the names of women in writing, since the honorific also of Maulana, our master, modifying her Bakhtiari husband's tribal affiliation, indicates that he was a revered member of society. The letter is undated, but it finds its way to Esfahan as a collector's item recorded in several late 17th century anthologies. Whether she wrote the letter or whether it was written by a man ventriculizing the generic voice of a wife, the epistle was disseminated and collected as authored by Maulana Bakhtiari's wife, Zane Maulana Bakhtiari. This is the history of reception that matters to the missive circulation and to my reading of the gendered language of complaint that claims female authorship. The performative voice of the Bakhtiari wife does not engage in the epistolary etiquette of refined writings collected in 17th century household anthologies. Far from enacting the aesthetics of adab or the etiquette required to display the skills of a letter writer, she eschews the emotional grammar of betrayal that had its own set of rules and affect in epistolary art. Instead, she uses a language of insult to communicate her emotions. What emerges in this letter, I think, is a vernacular deployed in female circles, an obscene language, which by the turn of the 20th century retreated into disrepute and disuse as Iranian women entered heterosocial public spaces. And I think Bibi Khanum Astarawadi is a good example that Afsane Najmawadi has worked on. The epistolary rhetoric divulges a familiarity as well with the lively poetry of Hijal, variously translated as lampoon, invective, or insult poems that had a long tradition in the Perso-Arabic cultures. These poems are almost inevitably filled with obscene language, from the scatological to the sexual. The gendering of Bakhtiari's wife's letter transfigures the genre of both hijab poetry and conventional letters written by male authors. The Bakhtiari rant breaks with epistolary conventions, using sexual insult as a conceit to invert both sexual and social hierarchies. I bring into term the rant to describe her complex address, appeals, and attacks, to imagine her strange and, you'll see, stunning speech, gathering itself into a female counter-discourse 2 centuries later. So the body of the rant. I have chosen to focus on this copy of the Bakhtiari woman's letter recorded in an anonymous late 17th century anthology compiled in Esfahan. The male anthologist suggestively opens his collection with her letter and then proceeds to record an all-male authored collection of refined epistolary samples, model prose composition, and poetry. With this act of transcription, he genders the anthology. Housed in the Majlis Library in Tehran, this anthology probably belonged to a family of literati or bureaucrats, because there are also official letters to the Mughal courtiers, who gathered into the manuscript their professional tools and mobile devices with which to work, socialize, and behave in the city. The household anthology was later sold in the bazaar and also possessed by new owners. We know that the spine is worn out. The binding actually suggests routine use. It's been repaged. You can tell here by this cut that it's actually been taken from the original and then pasted into a bigger size paper. It has 270 folios written in the original ink and in the original hand as well. And you have additions, right, in another ink and another hand with seals. The seal that you see on the left folio belongs to a certain Muhammad Hashim, who marks its passing from one owner to the other. The seal, as far as I could tell and read it, says something like Muhammad Hashim darad umid shafa'at. Muhammad Hashim has hope for intercession, and on top of it, then there's a sighe aqd muvakhat, so friendship, sworn friendships in Arabic itself, and several dates in the manuscript, most commonly 1100 Hijri or 1689, which I am assuming is to be the date of its compilation. So generated and then collected and assembled in this domestic sphere, these letters really also had an object of moving between households, right? And the letter of the Bakhtiyari shows us that indeed that was one of the first orders for these letters itself. She may have written it herself, her scribe may have written it, but the letter must have been placed in the hands of a trusted courier who then delivered it to her husband. And somewhere along the way, or perhaps subsequently, it was copied, shared, and then collected in this anthology. So the top, on top you read سواد کتابتی که زن مولانا بختیاری به شوهر خود نوشته, a copy of the letter written by the wife of Maulana Bakhtiyari to her husband, and then it's recorded diagonally, and it goes through until the next page. We immediately are made aware of the circumstance of her writing to her husband, as she begins with a reference to the ritual of gifting a souvenir by travelers upon their return from their journey, soqat. He had been traveling, and she expected him to return with an even symbolic souvenir that she refers to as insignificant as scraps of bears and fish. She associates her humble desire for a souvenir with Solomon's gift. According to popular lore, the Quranic prophet Solomon was to have received a gift of a dead grasshopper from an ant as a gesture of subservience. Even if Solomon had no use for the grasshopper, the gift was of value for the ant, who subsided on insects like the grasshopper. The analogy is illuminating. Those scraps of bears and fish, she says, were useless for the wife. They would have fulfilled the ritual traveler's gift of submission and honor. But not having received her anticipated gift, her disappointment sets the tone of the rant. Instead, I'm quoting, "My present is a dumbhead, shameless master of the cuckold, chief of monsters, lord of pimps, and most cunning of creatures. Surur Keidion." Attacking her husband with one insult after another, she denounces his moral defects. The language of insult is sexual. He is the rammer, he's the nuti, the sodomite, he's the cross-dresser, he's the mukhannas. The accusations of sexual depravity continue the rant. He is, the bare-ass homewrecker, khane barandoze kun berahne, the handkerchief bearer of whores who stand at the keyhole of wife-selling husbands, born of vice, dasmoldor qahbegon. In short, she asserts, his Maulana is but a gaping asshole. The Bakhtiyari woman is presented, or maybe presents herself, as a devoted wife who continually prays for her husband's success. While he was away, she tended to their farm, she irrigates the garden, she waters the meadows, and all the time using agricultural metaphors, which are actually very rare to find in a lot of these letters that have a provenance in Isfahan, to allude to the material and to the sexual. She says, I've built a hut with plentiful seeds and have not let, nor will I, allow the fields to be fallow. Despite laboring day and night to keep the house in order, she received blows on her head owing to her husband's despicable relations with male youth, with Lavandon. Her endless prayers for his protection and benefit are for naught. Her husband continues to engage with impudence in all that is forbidden, haram, and against the Sharia. The long list of moral depravity and impurity, najas al-ain, she uses, which are the things that are inherently impure, like pigs and dogs, culminate really in a grotesque designation of Maulana Bakhtiyari as the donkey of the Antichrist, on Khar Dajjal. Muslim apocalyptic literary and visual figurations of the Antichrist as monstrous is something that we see both in literature and in paintings. Before the awaited Messiah, the Antichrist is to make a short appearance with his pair, the donkey. Together they inaugurate the end of time, allowing for all sorts of inversions, right, sexual taboos, adultery, sodomy, to be practiced. Not only is the Bakhtiyari woman to have prayed and labored for the prosperity of her husband, but she has also satisfied, she says, his sexual duties as a good wife. Her rant targets her husband's beard, the symbol of male virility, where she says, your limp beard, oh petty ignorant man, a beard that was trimmed in my felt home. I think there's allusion here to something, maybe the luxury of her soft vagina. You receive benefit despite your negligence in my elevated hut. Once again, she appeals to her dutiful role as a wife and to his abandonment of conjugal duties. The euphemisms of limp beard is an insult, of course, that targets the key symbol of masculinity. But to add insult to injury, she has had to pay his debt, she says, with her own personal wealth. And I'm quoting, from my goods and belongings, your debtors have enriched. From the rent of minting presses, and I quite don't understand this, that dorol zarb, that pays for your leather, you have wasted your days in idle pleasure. The young men collectively have impure hearts and fear of evil of the friend and foe. They appease your dirty nature and make you content so that your shame is carried by me, this O pure one, in zaife ojize. The Bakhtiyari woman was informed about her husband's activities too during his travels from her spies. She says, now I've recently heard that every day you ingest drugs, bang, beer, bouzé, and 3 grams of poisonous opium. How dare you eat the shit of dogs and laugh at your beard? News of her husband's dereliction then is public because she's heard about it from probably his surrounding, his friends or his actually servants. And here in the body of a personal letter, she holds him accountable for his loss of dignity, for making light of his emasculation, laughing at his own limp beard. Her appeals and attacks end with a threat. Oh, miserable, shameful one, she says, I swear on the penis of the religious judge and the balls of the market inspector, Sogyan Bikir Qazi Khoye Muhtasab, that if you do not return in a month, I will bundle up all the account books into a saddlebag and open the door of my private chamber to young men and turn it into a domed building where wayfaring men sit in waiting. I will take my earnings and establish a religious endowment for the sick and the homeless. The rest, you know. Not only does she mock the religious authorities, she threatens her husband with the worst of masculine affronts, selling herself for sex if he does not return. And to boot, she will cleanse her sins with a pious act of charity. Building up to the final curse, her letter ends with the anticipated souvenir that she opened up her letter with and launched her rant. As for a souvenir, I demand the recipient of this letter, your penis smeared with sesame oil, pounded and mixed with the brain of a donkey. May your days of idiocy and foolishness never end. Gotta love this woman. Okay, so here you get a good sense of her language, the body of her rant as well. But I think her vernacular language that she uses too, with these insults to publicize the infidelity of the husband, really takes on, of course, these accusatory tones. And I think the rant projects a female voice that we really haven't heard in these anthologies, but I am hoping that there are many more. At the limit of what is permissible for her sex to write out in a letter, the rant materializes a female subject whose speech contests the very epistolary space that requires her submission. This practice of contestation through ranting also constructs its addressee. In the body of the letter, the Bakhtiari woman addresses her husband both directly and indirectly, moving between the first person I, the second person you, and the third person he, as though anticipating an audience who will bear witness to her husband's misbehavior through the conceit of a direct address. Her rant calls on readers to join in denouncing him. The Sharia law that subjugates wives and a social order that tolerates actually husbands' homoerotic affairs. The participation of an audience, I think, is critical to the production of the rant, which echoes a generic complaint of wives living and competing with the male homoerotic desires of their husbands. So sexual metaphors really locate her rants, as I said, in the agricultural idioms that she mentions. And I think, she also really breaks from this hijab, which is a male, genre of writing poetry that, mobilize insult as a form of really shaming men, right, into disrespect and disrepute, but the male object of ridicule really remains constant through these hijab poetry. But in the case of the Bakhtiari woman, I think it's the gender of the addressee that alters the perspective of the hijab. I mean, not only is it prose and not poetry as a transformation, but I think the gender of her address is important too. And the addressee and audience of the hijab poetry are commonly, right, as I said, men insulting other men, satirizing women's sexual desires as part of the economy of slandering men. But the Bakhtiari woman not only modifies the gender of the addressee, but she also inverts gendered stereotypes, turning beguiling and sexually promiscuous women into men like her husband. Where beards and pubic hair in the hijab are objects of erotic caricature, the letter mocks Morana Bakhtiari's beard and genitalia with explicit candor, making her invective as a wife even more irreverent. Her emotional affect, I think, overtakes the aesthetics, right? So at least the aesthetics that we are most exposed to in these model letters that appear in these anthologies, right? And unlike the conventions of the form of hijab poetry, the Bakhtiari woman does not adorn her rhetoric in a beautiful and polished style, though that does not take away from the effectiveness of her delivery, as you saw. Okay. So the Bakhtiari Rant was deliberately placed at the opening, as I mentioned. What's interesting, this first page, I think, is an additional page where somebody afterwards has written a table of contents. It's very useful to have a table of contents, right? Frankly, because that also really helps you understand what things are put together. So you see, Ghazals of Baba Ferrani, you have Sori Nomes, you have different letters on the top right, but written by the ulama of Mawarano Ola. But this person who's written the table of contents has not included the letter of the wife of Maulana Bakhtiari, as you see, which opens clearly the anthology and is the first recorded writing. So for the anonymous male anthologist, her letter clearly was remarkable. He must have wanted the reader to be exposed to it immediately, to recognize its singularity before scanning the rest of the poetry and epistolary samples that he had gathered, right? So, we have to think that it's circulated, men recorded. Why is it that men are recording this rant? So many So yes, sorry, I'm speeding up to be able to pass on. So these households copy many of these letters, right? Let me go to the circulation of the Bakhtiari rant is testimony, I think, to her voice, right? Resounding in the 20th century. But to the question that I was just posing, why was her letter slandering Maulana Bakhtiari's abandonment of his duties an object of male curation? How can we understand the agency of men copying and circulating this letter? The obscene language of rebuke initiates us, I think, into this intimate vernacular of women that our letter writer translates from the oral to the written, an affective language that entices a male audience to record her letter into the folios of the household anthology. There is an element of voyeurism and pleasure, I think, in the language of female insult that male anthologists must have appreciated. I can imagine the entertainment value, we're laughing here, for men, right, reading this letter aloud together. But her accusations, right, divulge the unreliability and fickleness of her husband. He is cast as this limp wimp, right? And her accusations really are not in any way embracing of the role that husbands would have taken ideally or like to hear about themselves. And yet, these are the men who collect this letter. Could these collectors have known Maulana Bakhtiari and used the rant as a tool of mocking and disgracing their enemy? Could his letter have been received as a didactic example for other men to take on their duties as husbands and abandon their deceitful ways of pleasure and male sex? These are questions that will remain to be unanswered. The multiple gendered reception of this letter, however, does not take away from the effect of its circulation as a letter written by the wife of Maulana Bakhtiari. Whether authored by a man or a woman, to create a community in which women sought to negotiate social, sexual, emotional spaces within marriage. If we consider women household readers who would have had access to this anthology all the way into the 20th century, the circulation of this letter may have been received as a warning not to trust husbands, just like Bibi Khanum Astarawi warns women in her book, who are careless, corrupt, and outright imbeciles. I can imagine a female community of readers forging solidarities through the circulation of this letter as a critique of patriarchy, cognizant of the rights of wives who are required to be loyal and devoted. The Bakhtiari woman is blunt, right? She's accusing her husband of neglecting his marital duties. And according to the Sharia, right, if the husband abandons his wife and his financial responsibility for 6 months, this could be cause for a legal divorce. But she, however, is not threatening him with a divorce, but with cuckoldry. She intimidates him with the shame he will have to bear if she engages in sex with other men, literally opening up the door of her private chamber to young men. Not only does she threaten to shame her husband, but she also implicates the hypocrisy of religious practices as she menaces to use money to earn and to make a charitable endowment. The Bakhtiari rant, I think, is a critique of her husband's affairs with younger men, right? Like, as we've heard, she expresses her anger against her husband, about his gullibility, that he's fooled with his friends as well. But her critique of her husband's affairs, I think, must be taken in some way, whether it's written by a man ventricularizing a woman, which kind of complicates what we know about the poetry praising male gazing. We know that it comes out of religious treatises against sodomy, but to actually have a woman or men writing in a woman's voice also gives us a larger understanding of this critique. So the circulation of her letter, and I'm going to end here, worked to forge the idea of a female subject in speech and address, free from allegiance to the world of husbands, a moral critique of masculinity, as well as a call for women to hold their husbands accountable. Not only does she chide her husband, right, but she's also talks about the anti-clerical clerics who engage in not really doing their work of prohibiting husbands from having male sex. Bless you. In the end, she has transformed the object of her anticipated souvenir as well as her dutiful position as wife. Instead, she demands from her husband his penis smeared with sesame oil, pounded and mixed with the brain of a donkey. Smeared, pounded, and mixed with the donkey brain, she has diagnosed her husband's sexual malady. I mean, these are remedies that were also used for men who were not virile. Her husband's sexual malady and desires his castration. He was no longer of use to her. Her final wish really is for his journey of idiocy and foolishness to endure and for him not to return. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. I will open the Q&A with a question of my own while you set aside your inhibitions and prepare your own questions. I have plenty of questions, some big, some smaller. I'll just stick to the shorter ones for now. My first question has to do, and it's really out of a place of total ignorance, but so regarding the authorship of the letter and how this authorship would have been identified and received by people who mythologized it, etc. So the name indicated is generic in a way. We cannot with this really.
Yeah, but the other Mastavi that I showed you, it's the same thing. Although because it's the Urdu body anthology, we know the name of the husband. But it is a generic, it's, Zane Rafan Nevis, right? And it's Mirza Khalil, right? And then she's referred to there with generic terms like Belghis Abani or... So I think that seems to have been convention when referring to wives of, So that may be not the case, that indicative, but it could be. It could. I mean, I think that one has to read it also potentially as an address by a generic wife.
And my question actually has to do with precisely what people would have identified with a name like this, and what kind of behavior would have been expected from that social group. Does it contrast? Does it confirm cliches and a prioris about the social group in question? I was just wondering what it does.
Yeah, I wish I knew to answer you. I think that precisely what I'm getting at is that I think this is a language of women. Now, whether it's written by men who heard this language in certain intimate circles, right, and who are mimicking it, right? We only know about these male spaces, right, and how Hedja is received, let's say, in their circles. But how would women receive it? I'm not sure. I'm speculating that it eventually, in time, as it's passed on, it does give and it does create what becomes a discourse that is much more prominent in the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century. I don't know how women would be. I mean, I think they would laugh like we would, right? And but again, historically, evidence to find reception for many things, but for this particular. I mean, one way to answer your question is, so one of the things that I looked at in my book was that we have so much coming from court or from the religious circles, right? So we really don't know how people are receiving. The anthologies give you a sense of reception, right? Because what they pick up, what they record matters to them, right? And what part of, let's say, an essay or a poem they record tells you something about what stands out for them. So, and again, I'm giving you a very general response, is that I think the fact that it's recorded in multiple majmu'as tells you that there was a value to it. Now, what exactly the value was it all of these things about humor, about empowerment of women, about warning towards husbands? I'm imagining that some of them had to come into play.
I see there are many questions. I'll keep my second question first, Peter. So I need
Thank you for such an interesting talk. My question, I think, is related, and it's about maybe if you could speculate about the relationship between the author and the anthologist, and particularly with something you said about the author having presumed an audience, which is a public audience, not just the husband.
She herself, or whoever wrote the letter.
Whoever wrote the letter.
Yeah, because
right?
she's actually speaking to us.
Exactly.
Right.
So the question is, I guess one question is, would the text have possibly had a circulation before making its way to an anthology? And what form would that have taken?
Yeah.
And then secondly, how would the anthologists have gotten this? Right? Like if let's say it was meant to be kept within a family, or is it if you could fill in a little bit of those details, the relationship between the authors.
So, again, I think we have to do a lot more work on these anthologies, but for the ones that I've seen and been able to, to decipher what kinds of letters actually are very popular, right? So, you have certain Noseroya Hamedani's letters are all over. Like, it's very difficult not to find an anthology that doesn't record it. So, it seems like what happens is that there's certain pieces, if it's not a personal letter from that family, that are great sample letters or a form of, like not only a refined form, but maybe a form of entertainment where it's read aloud, right? And I would speculate that those are in circulation in the city, right? And it's out of those letters and circulating in the city between, I would imagine, friends sharing them, right? I don't think it would be a kind of thing that coffee houses, but who knows? But it seems like the way in which they curate and select these authors of anthologies pick out what's available in the city in circulation. A lot of them, and this is again something that needs to be studied, how are they recorded? So you have Savod, you have Roque, you have, just the norme. You have all of these different technical terms of recording, right? Which for sure meant something, which to us, we have to really look at these practices more widely of recording in these anthologies to be able to decipher what's the difference between, a sabod of a letter, right? Or just the roque itself, right? Or bayaz of a letter, right? So I think that there's multiple forms of copying, and I see that with this Khonsari anthology that I worked on, and he had a scribe. He says he finds a letter in the city, he says, I don't know anything about but I'm actually copying it directly from the text and trying to actually be as accurate as possible. But he has to note, he has to tell us that, right? So I think very similar practices of recording that is happening in the religious circles and at court must have been also part of these collecting, processing, and then saying, oh, did you see this letter? And then, the anthologist is interested and records it, right?
Can you imagine a public reading of this? You said no.
I think that, yeah, definitely it must have been. I think most of these letters must have been also not only for, how to learn to write properly, right? Because actually what's happening with letter writing in this period of time is so interesting. So the ghazal, which is, an oral form, is being translated onto the letter in prose, right? So there's a lot of, the qaraz, a lot of the parts of the ghazal also are part of this form of letter writing. So I think for sure that there must have been an oral aspect to it. And I also think that, people who were not used to letters and received letters, right? So there has to have been some kind of a guiding tool that came along with it to be able to imagine not only, the lines of the ghazal, which really imagine the face and the figure of the person who's sending you the letter, but also to be able to, weigh the individual to get to know what the practice of letter writing is about.
Thank you very much. I have one observation and one question. My observation is about the very distinct scurrilous nature of this letter versus the adab stuff that comes later. I wonder if this kind of distinction is common across these household majmu'ahs, such that, if you're talking about the Arabic qasida, the speculation is that the nasib is to kind of soften up the reader, the listener.
I haven't seen anything like that. I think that's what it's so, it's remarkable, and this anthologist also put it at the beginning because it's not something very common. You usually, of course, qualities of letter, you have a variety of different kinds of letters. You have shorter kind of maybe like common letters that are written to ask for eyeglasses, to ask for yogurt, to ask for wine. So things that you don't need to actually be more elaborate about. And you have hierarchies of letters. Definitely in one manual that Rasul Jafarian has actually published on the Soleimani letters, Monshoat Soleimani, where there you get a sense of even like the hierarchy of letter writing. And even when you don't have it, says, so there's an acknowledgement that even if you don't know how to write, right, you put half of a seal and you just copy this one opening line of the qaraz, And so there is definitely, I would say, different ability of writing that you see in these letters, for sure. But I've never seen anything like this. But I'm sure it'll be there. But we're just beginning to look through and to see what all of these anthologies actually collect.
Well, my question is the practical one, because there is a lot of diagonal script and multi-directional writing.
Yes.
So how do you read it? Where do you start? Where do you end? And is this kind of common
Well, it
style?
starts here, it goes on here, and it goes on here, and then it goes on there, and that's maybe, is that your question? On a page, how do you read it, right? You have to maybe have people around the page. That's a possibility, but you have to realize that paper was rare and expensive, and so you used whatever parts you could of every piece of paper. If you write it, I think, just straight out, there's usually 20, 21 lines. Their sizes are all very different. Maybe there's more room if you write it diagonally. I have to look at that, but thank you for pointing it out.
Thank you so much. Wow. Thank you so much for this amazing talk. So, I mean, like, first, to me, it's weird, a little bit like a warning, right? This is what, if you don't follow what come next, to be a proper adab, you end up maybe like Maulana Bakhteri. But my question actually is about the social kind of geographical aspect, right? So you kind of mentioning this agricultural landscape a little bit coming through. Is it possible we have here a window into the way that people in the metropolis of Isfahan are mocking, right? This kind of periphery, agricultural periphery, and nomadic lifestyle, right? And these are not, what's going on here? These devious men, right? And we are the proper urban kind of, reformed sexual regulated.
No, I think you're absolutely right. There's definitely this kind of country bumpkin attitude there as well. And we see it in a lot of different kinds of exchanges. I mean, clearly the Esfahanese feel like they're trying to be also, refined. So I think that's part of the production of so many of these anthologies. There's this one encounter with a Herati who comes and writes a Shar or Shub in Esfahan, and Nasrabadi says, something like, yeah, you're coming from Herat, and I know that I'm just coming from Nasrabad, which is, a suburb of Esfahan. So you get a sense of definitely these kinds of geographies of what Herat was as an urban center and how cultivated Heratis were versus, these Esfahanis who are just beginning to get there. But I think that the Bakhtiyari reference definitely has something to do with them being outside of Esfahan. But then, of course, the question is, if that's the case, she has actually a very good command of the Persian language and of Persian insults. And so that then, one would imagine that if you would want to debase her, right, you would introduce something there where people who are literati and their reading is like, they would notice that she's not actually erudite or eloquent, right? I mean, her references to Suleiman's gift, this woman, or whoever wrote it knows about a larger cultural frame that is not at all uncivilized or uncouth.
Thank you for this wonderful lecture and the amusing letter. My question, I have two related questions. One, it's related to the woman's voice that you brought up. And I was wondering whether we could read it from the reverse angle, meaning that the woman's voice is kind of conveyed by a male author, and she is using kind of an indecent language, and she's talking about prostituting herself out to other people, and also she is using a vernacular and kind of keep ranting about her husband.
I was wondering if this could also portray the wife as kind of a caricature or an object of ridicule, and at the same time criticizing the deficient male agency of the husband. In other words, kind of venerating the male role, the complete male role to that respect. So using the woman's voice to kind of in favor of a kind of a more male dominant role. I wasn't here.
Yeah, that's totally possible. But I think what I'm arguing is that the fact that it's recorded and circulated in time, read by others in time, men and women in time, has a different kind of effect, right? Knowing and recording it as written by a woman. Even though originally, if we can, say that it was a man writing and it was ridiculing Bakhtiari and also this woman selling herself, that's possible. But I think the reception tells us something else about, again, how it was understood, how it was received as actually a female voice that wasn't just a figurative female voice.
Thank you so much, Professor Bobo. It was very interesting. I was wondering is it possible that, like, what were the characteristics of the letter that hinted to you that it's written by a woman rather than by a man? Because, I mean, for example, Berisha Khokhandidi is usually not something that I would tell as a woman to somebody, like, yeah, you're right, meaning that. So I was wondering whether you had some words that hinted you that it is actually written by a woman or not. Because, for example, hijab is something that has a long history in Shaba shares, especially men to show the masculinity. They want to, put down other men, especially using sexual insults.
Yes.
And this has had a long history. So I was wondering if this could be that, but, portrayed as a woman.
So, to be honest, me as a receiving this letter, what struck me first that it was the sarod of a letter written by Morana Bakhtiyari's wife. When does that happen? And I was given into it for sure. So I think that I am part of that reception history, and so that is also how I was affected to read it. Right? Definitely, Hijra and Hajj were in circulation, and was part of sort of a male bonding experience. But again, the creation of a female addresser and addressee, a gendered addresser and addressee, already there. That may be part of the play of Hajj as well. That's possible, but that's what it creates, right? And then I think that's how it's experienced, right? So if we go back to what you're saying about how could it have been experienced, it's like a play. There is an imagination of a man and a woman in as personages, right? In this story that she recounts for us in her voice, and I think that creation already of these characters and what they do or do not do for one another, that's the play that I'm interested in getting at.
Thank you for that talk. I really enjoyed it. I also have more of a kind of practical question, which is about the idea of the household in your research. So I was wondering, when working through these majmuas, how challenging is it to kind of identify them with a specific household? And do you do that primarily on the basis of like introductory or kind of paratextual notes and elements? Or is it really like diving into the contents of the anthologies that then kind of gives you that clue to figure out how to place it kind of in terms of the social makeup of the context that you're looking
That's
at.
a great question.
And then just to add one more thing to that, also I'm really curious about the difference between looking at, say, like urban archives from Isfahan as opposed to these that are sort of outside of the urban center. And is it more challenging, or are there sort of different challenges to sort of recreating like a familial lineage in working through
These are all great questions. So, as I said, the majority of these measures are anonymous. Very few have this table of content. So very few do you have the name of the scribe or the name of the owner recorded. So the way I've been and going through them and understanding where they belong, and I may be totally wrong, we still have to look through many more. It's like, what is the most prominent information that this anthologist compiles? So this one NEH grant that I got, I'm working on this Kazim, George Kazim's notebook. Right away you can tell. I mean, why is he recording both in Arabic and Persian these siqe aqd and ejode nomes and things like that? So one can tell what comes predominantly in, and it's not always in the beginning, but it usually is in the beginning, and then what surrounds in the margins, and then in additions, what other things surround like everyday pleasure with everyday work, right? And so that's how I've been going about it, but again, we really need to look at many more. But I think that, so when Cornell Fleischer was alive, we talked about it. In the Ottoman Majwis, he also felt that professions of individuals you can tell by what is collected as your work notebook, right? So the one outside of Isfahan, so we still have to. This was it is such a huge project that I limited myself for the book on just Majwis produced in Isfahan where we have a date, or when from these Danish Paju or somebody like Hoeri says that the paper is from the 17th century, that limited to Isfahan in the 17th century. We have to look at Qazvin, we have to look at Tabriz, we have to look at all of these different places as well. But I'm sure, I think from just a quick look, Isfahan is the main city of production.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I just had a kind of follow-up to one of the questions we had earlier about, the kind of city versus country masculinity that's being kind of staged in this letter. And I wonder whether you might entertain the kind of reverse reading to what you were just saying, which struck me when I was hearing you talk about it more, that in some ways this seems more like a kind of cautionary tale of what happens to men when they become too urbane and too urban and kind of get mixed up with, the pretty boys at the coffee house or whatever it might be. So, and if that reading is possible, that might fit into a kind of longer history of, in Islamic intellectual history of kind of troubling urban masculinity. And perhaps relatedly, I sorry if I missed this, but is there any evidence of sort of Bakhtiyari dialect coming through in this text, or is it pure kind of standard?
Not that I was able to decipher, but I should give it to somebody who is an ethno-linguist to be able to tell. I mean, I couldn't tell whether grammatically, idiomatically, I really couldn't tell another sort of a different ethnic group. But, I think I'm trying to avoid assuming that urbanity means boy gazing and it means bang and, all this stuff. I'm thinking that maybe that's not. just an urban thing. And, you know, one can assume that opium or, young boys were available for people outside in the provinces, men who had money, right? Men who, who actually paid these boys, right? So that's where I'm avoiding to actually put, I think we don't know enough, right? I mean, I think one thing that is so problematic when you do Safavi history is like, people say, oh, Safavi history, blah, 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 blah. And you know, you don't distinguish between what's happening in Esfahan, what's happening in Tabriz, what's happening in Qazvin. We are so geared to generalizing about everything that happens in the Safavid period based on the little that we know, right? So I'm trying to avoid actually saying, well, Esfahan, Urbain, and the Loris or Bakhtiaris, not, right? So yeah.
So much. It was amazing. There's a lot to think about. I'm very struck by her language, her sharp language, and the obscenity of her language. And I was thinking about, other women whose voice had been recorded. There are not many of those, but one that comes to my mind is Mahastei Ganjabi, who was lived
you're right.
much earlier, but again, I mean, she has very clear sexual metaphors in her poems. And interestingly, I mean, in this period that we have these city anthologies, we also have poetic anthologies. And one of the poets that people in that period are very much looking at and recording their poems is Mahasti, actually, and her Rubaiyat. And I was wondering, if you can make a claim about the general, the social milieu of this period, about, giving voice to women.
So I think it's not only Mahsati, Mehri. Mehri gets circulated with a lot of lewd poetry, in this period of time as well. So based on these fragments, I am, I'm thinking that this is a language, that's why I say it's a vernacular language of women, which we know, in the late 19th century with, historians like Najma Wadi, who's worked on Bibi Khanum Astar, for instance, that was a language that was spoken between women. Women actually spoke together, and they cursed together, and they spoke about, different sexual parts of their bodies and their husbands. I think, adab of what women are to say or not to say really comes later with this, as I say, like women coming into the public and then women having to discipline their language as well. And so that's how I see it in this larger, and I'm making, a longue durée claim for sure. But I would say Mehri is closer to, Esfahan in the 17th century. And, she has a very lewd language that she uses as well. And so, yeah, so I think that that's part of female vernacular.
We started a little too rapid.
Ooh, too many mics.
One more question, or should? Okay, so we'll close here. Please join me in thanking our speaker at Word today.